I wanted to break things down in terms of the numbers a little bit. About what percentage of Americans are white, non-Hispanic white? I think we're hearing from the census, like 59, 60%, is that right?
That is about right, yes.
Okay, so about 59% of every American, of all Americans, are white. That would mean about 40% of people are people of color, of the US population.
The first rule that you learn when you're reading a Thomas Sowell book is that statistics are uneven. All around the world where people are comparing one data set to another, the figures are lumpy. And usually it's nobody's fault. It's just the nature of nature. The universe serves up inequalities on a regular basis, and we may not like the way that those numbers look. Well, take a listen to the Congresswoman who's expressing some frustration that the percentages don't exactly match.
The population of the United States, as we mentioned, is about 59% white. Do you know what percentage of Congress is white? 75%. White Americans make up 60%, 59% of the US population, 75% of Congress. Men are 50% of the population and make about 70% of Congress.
So the Congresswoman there is comparing census data to sex and race in the workforce, in government employment, and she's concerned that those percentages are not identical, and they should be. She's implicitly saying that sex and race out there in society should be mirrored in government employment and in the professional world. Well, that's a really common social justice-y assumption that Thomas Sowell has critiqued many times over, including in his most recent book where he writes that a person who is expecting to see cosmetically equal outcomes is really just comparing the wrong things. Now, the author writes about a concept called reciprocal inequalities. Reciprocal inequalities, even if you've never heard that term before, you know what a reciprocal inequality is. It's when some groups are better at some things than other groups, and at the same time, they're less good at other things than other groups. Reciprocal inequalities. The author uses a nice ordinary example to illustrate this concept: alcohol production. So Scotland, the country, produces a lot of whiskey. Scotland makes a lot of whiskey. Fact. Scotland doesn't make a great deal of wine. Now, France makes a lot of wine, but France is not known for their whiskey. Germany, on the other hand, Germany makes a ton of beer. In fact, Germany has been making beer for thousands of years, and Germans have been traveling around the world teaching other countries how to make beer. It's a very safe and easy statement to make that Germany produces a wildly disproportionate amount of beer, at least compared to all the other countries. And obviously it would be extremely odd if France, Germany, and Scotland produced an identical amount of beer, whiskey, and wine, because the world just doesn't normally deliver that type of data. Thomas Sowell also writes of a far more relevant example, and that's the composition of the Supreme Court. So back in the 2010s, the Supreme Court was made up entirely of Catholics and Jews for a solid 8 years, in spite of the fact that the vast majority of the country is Protestant, and the presidents who appointed those Jewish and Catholic justices were also Protestant. So we could say that the Supreme Court was unrepresentative of the regular folks in the country. Now, as far as I know, I never heard of any Protestants who were saying that they were underrepresented or that they were pushed into the margins, but correct me if I'm wrong. So one of the more dicey examples in the book that a lot of people are kind of hesitant to talk about are the disparities in professional sports. Now, we don't like to acknowledge this out loud or in public, but hockey is dominated by white guys. Professional basketball is dominated by black guys, and I'm unaware of any evidence of hiring discrimination. I think those guys got there because they worked really hard. A lot harder than most people are willing to. And I would say the same thing about their female counterparts. It's just hard for me to imagine that a baseball player made the team just because he knew somebody and said, "Hey man, hook me up with a job." Now, if you want to see a more diverse sport, soccer and the UFC seem to look a little bit more like what the world looks like. But even then, when you take a closer look, there are disparities in those sports as well. It's also widely known that Asian Americans are massively underrepresented in professional sports, yet there's no evidence that they're being actively kept out by these organizations. And we learn about a reciprocal inequality when we see that Asian Americans are massively overrepresented when it comes to earning PhDs. Now, I know this is kind of an annoying rhyme or repetition that I keep doing, but there's no evidence, there's no reason to believe that these institutions are actively blocking non-Asians from earning PhDs. I think it's more likely that society just organizes itself unevenly.
We should not expect group equality across every aspect of human endeavor, and we don't see it. And this was Thomas Sowell's empirical point in book after book after book. Everywhere you look in the world, you see disparities, because everywhere you look in the world, you see cultural differences which reflect themselves in human behavior, which then redound to different representations in various areas of human activity. So disparities are not ipso facto a problem.
So now I'm going to make a bit of a departure here from the book, from the Thomas Sowell material. This is separate. I just think it's an interesting fact that women are roughly half the population of the United States, yet they're overrepresented by several percentage points in the university system, meaning women are earning bachelor's degrees at a much higher rate than men. And it's an inequality that I just don't really hear that much about. And I can't tell if it's good news or bad news. Is it progress that the university is becoming female dominated? Or should we be investigating why men are lagging at the college level? I don't really know. It's not a problem for me.
It would be good to encourage not an unreflective body, not unreflective workforce, but a workforce that barely even reaches the proportion of representation of what everyday Americans look like. That's somehow anti-white discrimination, anti-male discrimination, anti-straight discrimination, anti-cisgender discrimination. I mean, come on, folks. What are we doing here? What are we doing here?
So the Congresswoman there just casually used the term cis, and it kind of took me by surprise. I didn't expect to hear it in a professional setting. Now, maybe I need to make some new friends or something, but I don't personally know anybody who says that word unironically. I mean, I know that it's been accepted into our language. I just didn't know people are really hanging in there with that lingo. Now, I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence over here, but if you haven't already gotten caught up on this term, cis is a label that describes anyone who was born either male or female and decides to remain male or female, meaning they're staying with the default settings of their biology. Whatever they started with, they're going to continue. Well, that's almost all of us. So why does it require a label? Now, I know that I sound like I'm 90 years old trying to process this stuff right now, but I truly believe that this urge to categorize everything is meant to make the majority seem not normal. Because if the majority is normal, then everything outside the majority is considered abnormal, and abnormal is a rather insulting word. So it's defensive.
A cis male, have you ever heard of that term?
A cis male?
Cis male, C-Y-S-M-A-L-E. So what it means is that you are a man, you're born a man.
Well, as far as you know.
As far as I know. And you identify yourself as a man.
Yes.
That's a cis male.
Now, I don't understand. Where does that, is this a new phrase?
Yes, it's a way of marginalizing a normal person.